The call was supposed to be about a leaking pipe, but it became the execution of the life I knew. My name is Beatrice Collins, and for 28 years I believed family meant sacrifice. But standing in my quiet kitchen clutching a phone my father forgot to hang up, I heard the brutal truth through the static. I wasn't a daughter to them. I was a financial asset they planned to liquidate. They said they were going to erase me. They just didn't know I was recording. This is the story of how I stopped being a victim and started building a trap. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. My dad didn't mean for me to hear the part where he said he was going to erase me. If he had hit the red end call button on his screen just 1 second earlier, I would have gone on being the dutiful daughter, the one who quietly fixed everything while they took the credit. I would have kept playing my part in the perfect family tableau. But he didn't hit the button. And because of that small slip of a finger, the entire illusion of my life in our quiet Midwestern town shattered in the span of 30 seconds. I live in one of those places where the American dream still feels mandatory. It's a town of pickup trucks in driveways, American flags snapping on front porches, and neighbors who wave from their riding lawnmowers on Saturday mornings. We are raised on a very specific diet of values. Here, work hard, keep your head down, and above all else, honor your parents. Family is the religion that outranks everything. I was 28 years old and I had built my entire identity around those rules. I was Beatrice Collins, the good daughter. I worked as an assistant project manager at a local construction company, wearing steel-toed boots and managing contractors twice my age, dreaming of the day I'd get my own license to design and build homes. I had already clawed my way to a version of that dream. I owned a 3-bedroom craftsman bungalow on the edge of town. It wasn't a mansion. It was a starter home with good bones and a lot of cosmetic needs. But it was mine. That house represented every single thing I had sacrificed. I had skipped spring breaks and summer vacations to work overtime. I had paid off my student loans alone, eating ramen and boxed mac and cheese for years. I even ended an engagement because my fiancé couldn't understand why a chunk of my paycheck every month went to Ray and Teresa Collins. I told him and I told myself that it was just what you do. My parents were getting older. They needed help with medical copays, with the electric bill during the humid summers, with groceries. They had sacrificed everything to raise me. That was the refrain I heard at every Sunday potluck and backyard barbecue. I can still see my dad Ray standing by the grill at those parties, a beer in hand, bragging to the neighbors. He'd say, "RB, she doesn't mind helping out. She knows the value of family." He made it sound noble, like a moral victory, while he was quietly counting my money in his head. I believed the narrative. I believed that my role was to shrink myself so they could be comfortable. I thought we were a team. Then came the leak. It started as a small, insidious discoloration on my kitchen wall, the drywall bubbling like blistering skin. I was exhausted, pulling 60-hour weeks at the job site, and the last thing I had the energy to deal with was plumbing. But because my dad was a former handyman, I had been conditioned to believe I wasn't practical enough to handle these things without his input. So I did what I always did. I reached out for help, opening myself up to be ambushed. It was a Tuesday just after noon. I dialed his number, feeling that familiar knot of guilt for bothering him. When he picked up, the line was noisy. I could hear the clatter of silverware and the low hum of a lunch rush. He was at the diner with my mom. "What is it, Beatrice?" He answered, his voice sharp with irritation. I apologized immediately, my default setting. I explained the bubbling wall, the water pressure, asking if he thought it was the main line or just a pipe. "You can't do one thing without me." He groaned loud enough that I knew my mom could hear his performance of burden. He barked a few instructions about the shutoff valve, completely dismissive, before sighing heavily. "I'll look at it when we move in. Just don't wreck the wall, B." I frowned, the phone pressed to my ear. When we move in? That wasn't part of any plan I knew about. But before I could ask him to clarify, he muttered a goodbye. I heard the phone fumble a thud as he set it down on the table, but the line didn't go dead. The timer on my screen kept ticking. I should have hung up. Any polite person would have. But something in my gut, a cold premonition, froze my thumb over the screen. Instead, I listened. And that's how I found out exactly what my parents planned to do to me. I heard the scrape of chairs and a server asking if they wanted pie. Then the ambient noise faded slightly as they leaned in. The tone of their voices sharpened, turning conspiratorial. "Was that Beatrice again?" my mom asked. Her voice wasn't the fragile, weepy tone she used when she needed money. It was crisp, cold. My dad let out a heavy, disgusted sigh, the sound of a man burdened by a nuisance. "Yeah, our little project. She's so easy to steer." They laughed quietly. It was a dry, scratching sound. I stood in my kitchen staring at the wet drywall, feeling the blood drain from my face. Then my father said the line that shattered my world. "She's not a daughter, Teresa," he said, his voice low and hateful. "She's a debt we haven't collected yet. Once that house is in our name, we can finally erase her and retire." The words physically ambushed me. I grabbed the counter to steady myself, the room tilting violently. Erase her. Not help her. Not love her. Erase her. My thumb, shaking uncontrollably, hovered over the screen again. I didn't hang up. I pressed record. I listened as my mother, the woman who claimed she lived for her family, calmly outlined the rest of the plan. "We press the guilt," she said, sounding like she was reading a grocery list. "We remind her what we sacrificed. She signs, we move in, we sell. She'll never see it coming." I stared at the recording timer ticking upward. They didn't know it yet, but the girl they were planning to erase was listening, and I was about to start writing a new ending. I sat on my kitchen floor for a long time, the cool laminate pressing against my legs, the phone heavy in my hand. The recording had stopped playing, but the silence that followed was louder than their voices had been. I wasn't just processing a cruel conversation, I was realizing that I hadn't been ambushed just today. I had been ambushed my entire life. The shock began to wear off, replaced by a dull, throbbing clarity. I replayed the recording one more time, forcing myself to listen not to the words but to the tone. My mother sounded so calm. That hurt almost more than my father's venom. Her calmness suggested this wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment. It was a strategy she was comfortable with. Memories I had filed away under family loyalty suddenly looked very different in this harsh new light. I remembered being 10 years old, watching my dad come home late, grease under his fingernails. He would look at me, sigh loudly, and say, "I broke my back today so you could eat Beatrice. Don't you ever forget that." It was the seed of the guilt they would harvest for decades. Then I thought about high school. I had won a full-ride scholarship to a university 3 states away. It was my ticket, out, my chance to build something big. The night before I had to accept, my dad called me into the living room. His voice trembled, his eyes wet with performed grief. "If you leave," he had whispered, "it'll kill your mother. She's not strong enough to lose you." I stayed. I went to the local community college and lived at home, paying rent to them. I sacrificed my dream because they told me that's what love looked like. The pattern of exploitation was so clear now. I covered their car payments temporarily when Ray got laid off, but temporarily stretched into 3 years. I co-signed a personal loan for them at the local bank so they could fix their roof. He missed payments, and my credit score took the hit, not his. I even broke up with a man who loved me, a good man, who wanted to move us to Chicago because my parents threatened to cut me off if I abandoned the family. I had stayed to protect them, but they had only kept me around to consume me. I looked around my kitchen. When I bought this house with FHA assistance, I was so proud. I remembered hanging the yellow curtains with my best friend, feeling like a real adult. But then my dad had walked through the front door for the first time. He didn't say congratulations. He walked around, tapping the walls, nodding like a landlord inspecting a property. "Feels good knowing our family finally owns something decent," he had said. When I gently corrected him, "I own it, Dad," he had brushed me off with a wave of his hand. "There's no I in family, kid. Remember who raised you." That phrase, "who raised you," was his favorite knife. He used it to carve away my boundaries until there was nothing left. I pressed play on the recording again, skipping to the end. I heard my mom suggesting the pitch tell B they were struggling, that they needed to be on the deed to protect the asset from imaginary lawsuits. Then Dad's voice again. We get her to sign, we move in, we sell. She'll fold, she always folds. That's what we raised her for. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. They didn't sacrifice for me because they loved me. They invested in me expecting a financial return. I was a retirement plan they had been contributing to for 30 years, and now they wanted to cash out. Panic tried to rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I forced myself into the cold, practical mode I used at work when a project went sideways. If my own parents were willing to erase me on paper, I had to make sure they couldn't erase me in the bank system first. I sat there on the floor and opened my laptop. My hands were shaking, but my typing was steady. I froze my credit at all 3 bureaus. I set up transaction alerts for every single account I owned. I changed passwords on everything from my email to my retirement fund. I was narrating the steps in my head, methodical and detached. Lock the door. Bar the windows. Secure the perimeter. Then, on a hunch that made my stomach turn, I logged into my credit monitoring app. I scrolled down to recent activity. There, glowing in red text, was a hard inquiry from a regional bank dated 2 days ago. It was for a home equity line of credit. I had never applied for a HELOC. They were already trying to borrow against my house. They hadn't even waited for me to sign the deed. They were testing the waters, seeing if they could leverage my name. Stunned and furious, I dialed my father. I didn't wait for pleasantries. "Did you apply for a loan in my name?" I asked, my voice tight. He didn't even deny it. He didn't stutter. "We were just checking rates, Beatrice." He said, his tone dismissive, as if I were overreacting to a spilled glass of milk. "That house is a family safety net. Don't be selfish." "Selfish?" I choked out. "It's fraud, Dad." The line went silent for a second, and then the mask dropped completely. "You owe us, understand," he hissed, his voice dropping into that dark register I had heard on the recording. "We sacrificed everything for you. You don't get to keep that house while your parents struggle. If you fight us on this, don't be surprised when we erase you from this family." Erase. He used the word again. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a threat. I ended the call without screaming. I didn't cry. I felt a cold, iron resolve settle in my gut. I vowed right then that I would not be ambushed again. My next move had to be smarter than theirs. I opened a new browser tab and searched for a local attorney I'd heard about, Jordan Alvarez. He was known for being sharp, practical, and unsentimental. I typed out a summary of what happened, attached the audio file, and hit send. 5 minutes later, a reply popped up on my screen. Jordan's message was brief. "I've seen this before. If you're ready to protect yourself, come in tomorrow. But understand, once we start, there's no going back to normal family." I stared at the screen. I knew he was right. The family I thought I had was already gone. Now I just had to survive the strangers who had taken their place. The next morning, I sat across from Jordan Alvarez in a small utilitarian office that smelled faintly of stale coffee and laser printer toner. Jordan wasn't a handholder. He was a weapon. He pulled my property records and bank statements onto his desk, listening to the recording of my father's voice without flinching. When the clip ended, he didn't offer me a tissue. He leaned forward, clasping his hands. "This isn't family drama, Beatrice," he said, his voice flat and practical. "This is attempted fraud. If a stranger did this, tried to leverage your assets, and schemed to steal your title, you'd have called the cops already. You need to stop seeing them as your parents and start seeing them as the opposing counsel." That line rewired my brain. It stripped away the guilt and left only the cold, hard facts of the law. We spent the next hour building a war room strategy. Jordan outlined the steps, document every text screen capture, every transfer and archive, every voicemail where they mentioned sacrifice. He instructed me to move my savings to a credit union across town, one my parents didn't know existed. Then he dropped the biggest bomb. "You need to consider a quiet sale," he said. Get the equity out. Once you start locking down access, they will feel threatened. And when people like this feel threatened, they escalate. He was right. As soon as I locked my credit and ignored their calls for 24 hours, the smear campaign began. It was a calculated ambush on my character. At church, Ray and Teresa told anyone who would listen that I was turning my back on family after all they sacrificed. My phone blew up with texts from my aunt and cousins. Your parents look exhausted, B. How can you do this to them? I felt the walls closing in during a trip to the grocery store when a woman from the church choir cornered me in the cereal aisle. She placed a hand on my arm, looking at me with pity that felt like judgment. We're praying you come to your senses, dear, she whispered. I abandoned my cart and walked out. But the real escalation happened at work. My job site was my sanctuary, the one place where I was respected for my skills, not my obedience. 2 days later, Ray showed up. He stood by the chain-link fence, waving at the foreman like an old friend. When I walked over, mortified, he spoke loudly enough for my coworkers to hear. Good thing she's got us, he chuckled to my boss. Bee's always been too soft to stand on her own 2 feet. I felt my credibility evaporating in the heat. I pulled him aside behind a row of parked trucks, hissing at him to leave. He stepped into my space, his face hard. Sign the deed over and this all goes away, he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Keep fighting and I'll tell your boss you're unstable. I'll ruin this little career you love so much. He was willing to erase my professional life just to secure his retirement. That was the moment the fear turned into cold calculation. I didn't go home to cry. I went to meet Monica Reyes, a realtor Jordan recommended. We met in a coffee shop 3 towns over. You'd walk away with freedom and a check. Monica told me proposing an off-market sale to an investor. Your parents never have to know until the locks change. It felt like a betrayal of my grandmother's dream of generational stability, but I reframed it. They had tried to use this house to erase me. Selling it on my terms was the only way to save myself. The final breaking point came that weekend. My uncle hosted a barbecue at his farm and I was summoned. I knew it was a trap, but I went thinking I could reason with the extended family. It was an ambush disguised as a party. Under the festive string lights, everyone sat me down in a circle of lawn chairs. Ray performed his heartbreak perfectly, wiping his eyes. We're not asking for much, he told the group. Just a roof in our old age. That's what family does, I snapped. I stood up, my hands shaking, and told them about the secret loan application. I told them about the recording where he called me a debt. I looked at my aunts and uncles, begging for someone to be outraged on my behalf. Instead, they looked at their shoes. We don't want to get in the middle, my cousin muttered. Their silence was deafening. The community I loved was complicit. As the relatives drifted away to get plates of food, Ray cornered me by the pasture fence. The performance was over. His face was twisted with genuine hatred. Listen to me, Beatrice, he spat. You were never some miracle. You were a bill. We fed you, we housed you, and you still turned out useless. That house. That's the only return we're ever getting. You are the worst investment we ever made. The words landed harder than a physical slap. Worst investment. It wasn't about love. It never had been. It was about ROI. In that moment, whatever part of me still believed my parents loved me, died. And something else stood up in its place. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I just turned and walked away from him mid-rant, something I had never done in my life. That night, I met Monica in her car and signed the preliminary paperwork to sell the house. My hand didn't shake. They had ambushed me my whole life using guilt as their weapon. This time I was building the trap and inviting them to walk straight into it. The extraction was surgical. For 3 days, I lived in a state of controlled adrenaline, packing my life into cardboard boxes while my parents thought I was at work. I marked everything with colored tape, green for me, red for the things they had stored in my garage. I rented a climate-controlled storage unit for their belongings, paying 6 months in advance so they couldn't claim I had stolen or discarded their property. Then came the closing. It was done quietly in a lawyer's conference room with the blinds drawn. When the wire transfer hit my new credit union account, I stared at the balance on my phone. It was a surreal number large enough to buy my freedom, all because I had refused to be erased. The explosion happened on a Saturday. My phone was already off, but my neighbor texted me the play-by-play. Ray and Teresa arrived with a rented moving truck, expecting to bully their way through the front door and start measuring for new curtains. Instead, their keys didn't turn. They found the envelope taped to the oak door they claimed they owned. Inside were the new owner's contact info, the storage unit key, and a note from me. "The house is sold. Your belongings are safe in storage. Do not contact me." My neighbor said Ray screamed so loud the dogs across the street started barking. He kicked the door, raging about thieves and ungrateful children, threatening to make the whole town see what I really was. Teresa just stood there, leaving me voicemail after voicemail. Some were sobbing, begging me to come back. Others were ice cold, asking how I could erase my own parents like that. They didn't just get mad, they got legal. A week later, I was served with a lawsuit. They had found a cheap, hungry lawyer willing to file a suit claiming elder abuse, alleging I had stolen a family asset and that I was mentally unstable. They didn't stop at the courts. They called my company's HR department, claiming I was dangerous and a thief trying to get me fired to cut off my resources. I felt the ambush coming from all sides, the community whispering, the pressure mounting. But this time I didn't fold. I forwarded every threat to Jordan. "Court isn't therapy, Beatrice," Jordan reminded me as we prepped our defense. "You may not get an apology, but what you can get is protection." The day of the hearing, the courtroom air was stale and recycled. Ray and Teresa had dressed for the performance of their lives. Ray wore an oversized cardigan that made him look frail. Teresa wore a soft floral dress, clutching a handkerchief. They looked like the victims of a tragedy. Their lawyer spun a narrative about a cold, heartless daughter who had forgotten American family values, abandoning the parents who had sacrificed everything to raise her. I watched the judge, a stern woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, listening intently. She looked sympathetic to them. My stomach twisted. Then it was my turn. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I channeled that Mr. Ballin-style narration I had been practicing in my head, calm, factual, linear. I walked the court through the timeline, and then Jordan played the recording. My father's voice boomed through the courtroom speakers, stripped of his good neighbor charm. "She's not a daughter, Teresa. She's a debt we haven't collected yet. Once that house is in our name, we can finally erase her and retire." The silence that followed was absolute. The court reporter stopped typing. The judge's expression shifted from sympathy to something hard and sharp. Ray shifted in his seat, his face reddening. But we weren't done. Jordan introduced the intent to transfer document they had submitted as evidence, a piece of paper they claimed I had signed agreeing to give them the house. Jordan then projected my work logs and a plane ticket on the screen. The day that document was supposedly signed, I was 400 miles away at a site inspection. "This is a forgery, Your Honor," Jordan said plainly. "This is fraud." Cornered Ray's mask didn't just slip, it shattered. He stood up in the witness box, his face purple with rage, unable to maintain the frail old man act. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "I raised you," he yelled, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You think you can just walk away? Kids these days think everything is free. You were a damn bill from the day you were born." "Beatrice, that house was supposed to be our payback." He had said the quiet part out loud. He had admitted to a judge and a room full of witnesses that I was nothing more than a financial instrument to him. The knife line hung in the air, severing the last thread of obligation I felt. The judge slammed her gavel, but the damage was done. She looked at my parents with undisguised disgust. "You tried to ambush your own daughter," she said, her voice cutting through Ray's sputtering. "You tried to erase her for profit. This court will not reward that." She dismissed their suit with prejudice, granted me a permanent restraining order, and stated for the record that she was forwarding the file to the district attorney for potential criminal charges regarding the forgery. The sound of the gavel striking the wood didn't sound like punishment to me. It sounded like a starter pistol. I walked out of the courthouse into the blinding afternoon sun. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Jordan. "You're protected now. They can't touch you legally." I reached into my pocket and closed my hand around the key to my new apartment. For the first time in my life, family didn't mean people who could threaten to erase me. It meant whoever I chose next. The fallout in a small town is never silent. It's a slow, grinding echo. After the court ruling, the illusion of the saintly Collins family didn't just crack. It shattered into irreparable dust. Ray and Teresa's reputation fractured almost overnight. The same neighbors who used to wave at Ray while he bragged by the grill had heard the stories, and more importantly, some had been in the courtroom to hear the screaming. People stop waving when they realize the nice guy next door is capable of fraud. My phone started buzzing with a different kind of ambush messages from extended relatives offering half-hearted apologies. Cousins who had ignored me for years suddenly texted saying, "We didn't know it was that bad," or, "We're so sorry, we just didn't want to take sides." I didn't block them, but I didn't invite them back in either. I answered politely, keeping them at arm's length, realizing that their silence when I needed help was a choice they had made. They had weaponized the American ideal of family first to keep me quiet, and I was done playing by those rules. I spent the first few weeks of my new life in a small apartment complex on the other side of the city. It was nothing like the bungalow. There was no yard, just a small concrete balcony, and the appliances were cheap and noisy. But it was completely, undeniably mine. One night, sitting on the floor of my living room surrounded by half-packed boxes, I finally let myself cry. I didn't weep for the house I knew selling it was the price of my freedom, and I didn't cry because I missed my parents. I cried for the parents I wanted, the ones I never actually had. I grieved the little girl who believed that if she just made herself small enough and gave enough of her paycheck, she would finally be loved. Cutting them off felt like amputating a limb. It was a trauma, but it was the only way to stop the infection from spreading. I acknowledged that in order to survive, I had to erase the part of me that lived for them. Rebuilding meant finding a new definition of community. A week after I moved in, my neighbor, a single mom with 2 loud, happy kids, knocked on my door and invited me to a building cookout. I hesitated, my old instincts telling me to hide, but I went. It wasn't like the stifling church potlucks of my childhood where judgment was the main course. This was a diverse mix of people, immigrants, older folks, living on fixed incomes, young families just starting out. We sat on plastic chairs eating hot dogs and swapping stories about bad landlords starting over and second chances. I realized then that community isn't just bloodlines and obligation. It's people who show up for you without demanding you sacrifice yourself on an altar to earn a seat at the table. I used a portion of the equity from the house sale to invest in myself, not as a debt to be collected, but as a future to be built. I finished my contractor certifications and drafted a business plan. I called it Collins Renovations. I debated changing my name, erasing the Collins from my identity entirely to sever the link to Ray, but I decided against it. I wouldn't let them take my name too. I would keep it, but I would redefine what it stood for. My business focused on helping women and seniors navigate home repairs without being scammed, the kind of protection I wished I'd had. I hired an older retired carpenter named Sam as my mentor. He was gruff but kind, the kind of man who taught me how to frame a wall without making me feel small. And slowly, I started letting people in again. I met a man through work, an electrician, who listened more than he spoke. There was no instant fairy tale romance, just the quiet, steady hum of mutual respect. He didn't want to rescue me, and I didn't need him to. Through Jordan, I eventually heard the final loose ends of my parents' fate. The district attorney had opted for a plea deal to avoid a long trial, and my parents had moved to a small apartment in a neighboring county, far enough away that I wouldn't run into them at the grocery store. When I heard the news, I waited for a surge of triumph or anger, but I felt strangely neutral. I realized that justice isn't about revenge or watching them suffer. Justice is simply the act of not letting them ambush my life anymore. I think a lot about the word sacrificed. My dad wielded it like a weapon, a debt I could never repay. Now I choose what I'm willing to sacrifice. I sacrifice my time for my education, my energy for my business, and my effort for the people who actually show up for me. For the first time in my history, I am not sacrificing myself. One evening, 6 months after the court date, I stood alone on my small balcony. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows over the parking lot. I could hear kids playing below, and the distant bark of a dog, the hum of regular American life. My phone was in my pocket, silent. No parents were calling to threaten me. No relatives were guilt-tripping me about duty. It was just quiet. I thought about my father's voice in that courtroom screaming that I was the worst investment they ever made. I smiled, a genuine, easy smile. He was right in a way. They saw me as a bad investment because I refused to pay out the dividends they felt they were owed. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, I rewrote that line in my head. They thought I was an asset to be liquidated. I turned out to be the one thing they could never really own. My parents tried to erase me for a house. They ambushed my life and called it love. But in the end, I walked away with something better than a deed. I walked away with myself. And this time, I'm not for sale. And with Beatrice's final defiant act, the painful chapter of family obligation was finally closed, leaving her with a quiet, hard-won peace. If this story of resilience resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more deep-dive narratives. Let us know your thoughts on Beatrice's ultimate choice in the comments below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.